Hello and welcome to the Whispering Worlds channel. Sophie, a married woman with a seemingly stable life, reconnects with her high school love, Ethan, sparking an affair that unravels both their lives. Drawn to the excitement and validation Ethan offers, Sophie jeopardizes her marriage and family, while Ethan's betrayal devastates his wife and children. As the consequences of their choices come to light, both Sophie and Ethan face the fallout of broken trust, strained relationships, and personal guilt. Sophie confesses to her husband, Ben, and the two embark on a painful journey of rebuilding their marriage, driven by their love for their daughter, Lily. Meanwhile, Ethan loses his marriage and must confront his own flaws as he begins to rebuild his life apart from Sophie. In the end, Sophie and Ben find a fragile but growing sense of healing, learning to move forward with honesty and resilience. The story is a bittersweet exploration of the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. The coffee shop buzzed with the hum of conversation, steam rising in soft clouds above mismatched mugs. Sophie lingered by the counter, idly scrolling through her phone while waiting for her order. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting warm patches on the wooden floor. A gentle nudge from behind startled her out of her thoughts. "Excuse me," the voice began, and Sophie turned, her polite apology catching in her throat. There he was, a face she hadn't seen in over a decade but recognized instantly. The years had added a touch of gray to his temples and faint laugh lines around his eyes, but his unmistakable charm remained intact. Ethan Harris. Her Ethan Harris, or so she had thought in high school. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice wavering between disbelief and delight. His eyes widened in recognition, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Sophie Reynolds," he said, testing her name as though it were a memory made tangible. "Wow, how long has it been?" "Too long," she replied, her heart fluttering. She felt an inexplicable warmth wash over her, a strange mixture of nostalgia and excitement. The barista called out her name, and she collected her latte with trembling hands. Ethan ordered his drink and turned back to her, his posture relaxed, as though this chance meeting was the most natural thing in the world. "Are you still in town?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Yes, well, sort of. I'm in Midtown now, married with a daughter. And you?" "Still in the area. Married too. 2 boys." He chuckled, his tone laced with pride and something else Sophie couldn't quite place. Their conversation meandered through safe topics: careers, kids, mutual acquaintances. Yet the air between them seemed charged with unspoken questions. When their drinks were ready, Ethan hesitated before saying, "It's really great seeing you. Maybe we should catch up properly sometime." Sophie hesitated. She should have declined, politely excused herself, and left the moment behind as a pleasant memory. Instead, she nodded. That would be nice. Later that evening, Sophie sat at the dining table, watching her husband, Ben, help their daughter, Lily, with her homework. Ben was steady and reliable, his soft-spoken demeanor a counterpoint to her more impulsive tendencies. They had built a comfortable life together, a modest home, a close-knit circle of friends, and a routine that bordered on predictable. But as Sophie stirred her tea, she realized that Ethan's reappearance had stirred something else within her, a restless yearning she thought she'd outgrown. 2 weeks passed before Sophie heard from Ethan again. His text was casual, asking if she'd like to meet for lunch. She stared at the message, her pulse quickening. Rationality warred with curiosity, but curiosity won. Their lunch meeting was at a quaint Italian bistro downtown. Ethan was easy to talk to, his wit and charm as disarming as they'd been in their youth. He spoke of his work in architecture, the challenges of raising 2 boys, and his occasional frustration with the monotony of suburban life. Sophie found herself laughing more than she had in months, her worries momentarily forgotten. "Do you remember Mrs. Callahan's biology class?" Ethan asked, a mischievous grin tugging at his lips. "You had that ridiculous rivalry with Brandon Miller." Sophie laughed, the memory vivid. "He cheated off my test and still managed to score higher than me. I never forgave him for that." Ethan's laughter was warm and genuine, and for a moment, Sophie felt like a teenager again. They lingered over their meal, the conversation weaving between shared memories and current realities. When they finally parted ways, Ethan hugged her briefly, his touch lingering just long enough to unsettle her. That evening, Sophie found herself lost in thought. Ben noticed her distraction and asked, "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just tired," she lied, offering him a faint smile. But the truth was more complicated. The boundaries of her carefully constructed life suddenly felt blurred, and the safe, familiar world she shared with Ben seemed less certain. She told herself the lunch with Ethan was harmless, a simple reunion between old friends. Yet deep down, she knew it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet define, something thrilling and dangerous. As the weeks went on, Sophie and Ethan's encounters became more frequent. At first, their meetings seemed coincidental, a chance run-in at the grocery store, a mutual attendance at a community event. But soon they stopped pretending. Texts turned into phone calls, and phone calls turned into long, intimate conversations. Their connection deepened, tethered by shared secrets and unspoken desires. One afternoon, as they walked through a quiet park, Ethan stopped abruptly. "Sophie, I've missed this. Talking to you, being with you, it feels easy." Her breath caught. "I know. It does for me too." The words hung between them, fragile and charged. For the first time in years, Sophie felt truly seen. But with that feeling came a gnawing guilt, a whisper of betrayal that refused to be silenced. Still, she didn't pull away when Ethan reached for her hand. Back at home, Sophie's guilt festered. She tried to channel her unease into affection for Ben and Lily, but her efforts felt hollow. The image of Ethan lingered in her mind, an unwelcome yet irresistible presence. She told herself she could stop, that she hadn't crossed any lines she couldn't return from. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was already too far gone. Sophie's heart pounded as she stepped out of her car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the quiet street. The address Ethan had sent led her to a small, secluded coffee shop on the edge of town. She hesitated by the door, her conscience warring with her curiosity. But the pull was too strong and she stepped inside. Ethan was already there, seated at a corner table, his fingers drumming lightly against the surface. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that sent a jolt through her. He stood and gestured for her to join him. "Hey," he said softly, his voice laced with warmth. "Hi," Sophie replied, her own voice shaky. She slid into the chair opposite him, acutely aware of the intimacy of the setting. They ordered coffee, but neither of them seemed interested in their drinks. The conversation began with the usual pleasantries, but it didn't take long for Ethan to steer it toward more personal territory. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Every time we've talked, it's felt different, right?" Sophie's breath hitched. She looked down at her hands, the wedding ring on her finger gleaming under the soft light. "Ethan, this isn't fair. To Ben. To your wife." "I know," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this way. Can you?" She met his eyes, and the vulnerability she saw there unraveled her resolve. She shook her head, barely whispering, "No." The silence that followed was electric, charged with the weight of unspoken decisions. Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was brief but sent a thrill through her. "Let's go somewhere," he said, his voice barely audible. Sophie's stomach churned, torn between the life she knew and the temptation sitting before her. She nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. They left the coffee shop together, their steps hurried and their destination uncertain. The hotel room was dimly lit, the air thick with anticipation. Sophie stood by the window, staring out at the city lights, her mind racing. Ethan stood behind her, his presence both comforting and unnerving. She turned to face him, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Only if you want to." She closed her eyes, searching for clarity but finding none. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, but the pull of the moment was stronger. When Ethan's lips met hers, it was as though a dam had broken. The kiss was urgent, desperate, filled with years of unspoken longing. For a brief moment the world fell away, leaving only the two of them. But as they pulled apart, reality came crashing back. Sophie's mind swirled with guilt and exhilaration, the lines between right and wrong blurring beyond recognition. The next morning, Sophie sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. The gravity of what she'd done settled heavily on her chest. She told herself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. When she arrived home, Ben greeted her with a warm smile. "You're up early. Everything okay?" he asked, kissing her cheek. "Yeah," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some fresh air." As she watched him prepare breakfast, a pang of guilt stabbed at her. She wanted to believe she could bury the memory of the night before and move on. But even as she resolved to put Ethan out of her mind, her phone buzzed with a message from him. "Thinking of you." Sophie's heart raced as she read the words. She knew she should delete the message and end things before they spiraled further out of control. Instead, she typed a reply, "Me too." Sophie tried to fall back into her normal routine, but the cracks in her carefully constructed life were growing wider. Each day seemed heavier, her conversations with Ben more stilted, her interactions with Lily tinged with guilt. She told herself to focus on her family, to block Ethan out of her mind, but his presence lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. At work, her colleagues noticed her distraction. During a team meeting, her friend and coworker, Anna, leaned over and whispered, "You seem off today. Everything okay?" Sophie forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Lily's been having trouble sleeping." Anna gave her a knowing look but didn't press further. Still, Sophie felt exposed, as though the secret she harbored was written all over her face. She spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact, burying herself in paperwork to keep her thoughts at bay. That evening, Ben suggested a date night. "We haven't gone out in ages," he said, his tone light but insistent. "How about Friday? I'll book the babysitter." Sophie hesitated. The idea of spending a romantic evening with Ben filled her with unease. "Sure," she said, plastering on a smile. "That sounds nice." But as Friday approached, her anxiety grew. She texted Ethan less, trying to convince herself that she could rebuild the emotional bridge with Ben. When the night finally arrived, they went to a cozy French bistro in Midtown, the kind of place they used to frequent before Lily was born. The food was exquisite, the atmosphere intimate, but Sophie felt like she was watching herself from the outside. Ben reached for her hand across the table. "You've been so distant lately," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay? Work? Home? Us?" Sophie's chest tightened. "I'm fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Work's just been stressful." Ben studied her for a moment before nodding. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me, sophomore. You know that, right?" "I know," she said, her voice barely audible. She looked down at her plate, unable to meet his gaze. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the tension between them was palpable. Sophie felt like a fraud, playing the part of a devoted wife while her mind drifted to someone else. The next day, Sophie found herself parked outside a library where she had arranged to meet Ethan. She told Ben she was running errands, a lie that came too easily. When Ethan arrived, his presence reignited the exhilaration and guilt she had tried to suppress. They sat in his car, the windows fogged from the chill outside. "How was your date night?" Ethan asked, his tone light but probing. Sophie winced. "It was fine. Ben's trying, but I don't know." Ethan reached out and touched her hand. "You don't have to explain. I get it." His understanding felt like a balm and a betrayal all at once. They talked for hours, their connection deepening with every shared story and stolen glance. By the time Sophie returned home, she felt both exhilarated and hollow. The cracks in Sophie's life were becoming impossible to hide. At dinner one evening, Lily asked, "Mommy, why are you so quiet all the time?" Sophie's fork clattered against her plate. "I'm not quiet," she said, forcing a laugh. "I'm just thinking." Ben looked at her, his brow furrowed. "She's right. You've been somewhere else lately." Sophie bristled. "I've just been busy, that's all." "Busy with what?" Ben's voice was calm but firm. "You're home by 6 every night. What's going on, Soph?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air in the room grew heavy, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Lily fidgeted in her seat, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Finally, Sophie stood. "I'm going for a walk," she said, grabbing her coat. She didn't wait for Ben to respond before she stepped out into the crisp evening air. As she walked through the neighborhood, her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "I miss you." Sophie stared at the screen, her emotions a chaotic swirl. She wanted to confide in someone, to share the weight of her turmoil, but the only person she could turn to was the one causing it. When Sophie returned home, Ben was waiting for her in the living room. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She nodded, her heart pounding as she sat down. Ben's eyes were filled with concern and something else. Suspicion. "I don't know what's going on with you," he began, "but it feels like you're slipping away. I love you, Soph, but I can't help you if you won't let me in." Sophie's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself and beg for forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said, "I'm sorry. I'll try to be better." Ben's shoulders sagged, and he nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I just want us to be okay," he said softly. "Me too," Sophie replied, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. As they sat in silence, Sophie realized that the cracks in her life weren't just her doing. They were the result of choices she had made and ones she hadn't yet dared to make. And they were only getting deeper. Sophie spent the following weeks walking a tightrope, balancing between her home life with Ben and Lily and the clandestine connection she couldn't resist with Ethan. Every stolen moment with him heightened her guilt, but it also ignited a passion she hadn't felt in years. She told herself that she could control it, that it hadn't gone too far / 2014 until it did. It was a Saturday afternoon when Sophie and Ethan met again, this time at a private art gallery tucked away in the city. Ethan claimed he had a client who owned the space, but Sophie suspected he chose the location for its discreet nature. They wandered through the rooms, the colorful paintings and abstract sculptures a sharp contrast to the quiet tension between them. "This one's my favorite," Ethan said, stopping in front of a piece that featured a stormy ocean, its waves captured mid-swell. "It's chaotic but beautiful, kind of like us." Sophie laughed nervously. "Is that how you see this? Beautiful?" "I see you as beautiful," Ethan replied, stepping closer. His voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper. "And I see us as inevitable." His words struck a chord Sophie didn't want to acknowledge. "Ethan, we're playing with fire," she said, her voice trembling. "We both have families, people who trust us." "I know," he said, his expression serious. "But I can't stop. And I don't think you can either." Sophie looked away, her resolve crumbling. When Ethan reached out to touch her face, she didn't pull back. The kiss that followed was tender but full of longing, as though they were both aware of how fragile their stolen moments were. It wasn't until they heard footsteps echoing through the gallery that they broke apart, guilt written across both their faces. That evening, Sophie returned home to find Ben and Lily playing a board game in the living room. Lily's laughter filled the space, a sound that should have been comforting but only deepened Sophie's sense of alienation. She stood in the doorway watching them and felt like an outsider in her own life. Ben noticed her and smiled. "Hey, you're back. Want to join us?" "Maybe later," Sophie replied, her voice hollow. "I need to lie down for a bit." She retreated to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her. As she sat on the edge of the bed, her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "I can still taste you." Sophie's stomach twisted. She threw the phone onto the nightstand and buried her face in her hands. How had she let it come to this? The unraveling didn't stop there. Sophie's absences and distracted behavior began to draw attention, not just from Ben but from her friends as well. During a lunch outing with Anna, the cracks in Sophie's FA\U00E7 became glaringly apparent. "You've been so distant lately," Anna said, sipping her iced tea. "Is everything okay? You can tell me if something's wrong." Sophie forced a laugh. "I'm fine. Just a lot going on at work and home." Anna studied her for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "Are you sure? Because you don't seem like yourself." Sophie's grip tightened on her glass. "I appreciate your concern, but really, I'm fine." Anna didn't press further, but her expression made it clear that she wasn't convinced. Sophie left lunch feeling exposed, as though Anna could see straight through her carefully constructed lies. The tipping point came during a family dinner at Ben's parents' house. The evening started innocuously enough, with Ben's mother fussing over Lily and his father recounting a story from his youth. But Sophie's mood was brittle, and when Ben casually mentioned her frequent errands, she felt the room tilt. "You've been busy these days," Ben said, his tone light. "Always out running errands." Sophie's fork clattered onto her plate. "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped, her voice sharper than intended. Ben raised an eyebrow, surprised by her reaction. "Nothing, just an observation." Sophie's cheeks burned as everyone at the table turned to look at her. "Well, maybe you shouldn't make observations like that," she muttered, pushing her chair back. "Excuse me." She fled to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. As she stared at her reflection in the mirror, the realization hit her like a freight train. Her carefully balanced double life was collapsing. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. That night, as Sophie lay in bed beside Ben, she stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she knew without looking who it was. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she read Ethan's message. "I need to see you." Sophie's heart ached with longing and fear. She typed back a single word: "Tomorrow." The next day dawned gray and overcast, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror Sophie's mood. She spent the morning avoiding Ben's questions about her plans for the day, claiming she needed to catch up on work. The lie sat heavy on her tongue, but she pushed it aside. By the time she parked her car outside the small inn where she had agreed to meet Ethan, her heart was racing. Ethan was waiting for her in the lobby, leaning against a polished wooden counter. His smile was both reassuring and disarming. "You made it," he said, his voice low and warm. "Yeah," Sophie replied, her throat tight. "I'm here." They checked into a room without speaking, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. Once inside, the silence stretched, neither of them sure how to begin. Ethan finally broke it, taking her hands in his. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Or anyone else. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way." Sophie's resolve crumbled under his gaze. "I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking. Us, it feels so right, but everything about it is wrong." Ethan cupped her face, his thumb brushing away the tear that escaped her eye. "Then let's stop pretending. Let's figure it out together." Meanwhile, back at home, Ben paced the living room. Something wasn't adding up, and the pieces were beginning to click into place. Sophie's increased absences, her distracted demeanor, the way she avoided his questions. It all pointed to something he didn't want to believe. When Sophie's phone buzzed on the counter, Ben hesitated. He knew it was wrong to invade her privacy, but his growing suspicion outweighed his guilt. He picked up the phone, and his stomach dropped when he saw the notification. "Ethan, can't wait to see you." Ben's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and confusion. He put the phone back where he found it, but the damage was done. His heart pounded as he tried to process what he had just seen. At the inn, Sophie and Ethan lay entwined on the bed, the storm outside matching the turmoil in her heart. For a fleeting moment, she felt a sense of peace, as though the rest of the world had faded away. But reality returned with a vengeance when her phone buzzed. She sat up, reaching for the phone on the nightstand. It was a message from Ben. "Where are you?" The simple question was enough to send a wave of panic through her. Ethan noticed the change in her demeanor. "What's wrong?" "It's Ben," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "He knows something's up." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We can't keep doing this, Sophie. If we're going to move forward, we need to be honest." "Honest?" Sophie laughed bitterly. "Do you know what honesty would do to our families?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand. "Maybe it's time to stop living two lives. For both our sakes." That evening, Sophie returned home, her mind swirling with Ethan's words and Ben's message. She found Ben sitting at the kitchen table, his face unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his tone calm but firm. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding. She sat across from him, her hands clenched in her lap. "Where were you today?" Ben asked, his eyes locking onto hers. Sophie opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. The truth was like a boulder in her chest, too heavy to lift. "Running errands," she said weakly. Ben's expression hardened. "Don't lie to me, Sophie. I saw the message on your phone. I know about Ethan." The words hung in the air, suffocating and final. Sophie's breath caught, and tears welled in her eyes. "Ben, don't," he interrupted, his voice shaking. "Just tell me how long this has been going on." Sophie's shoulders sagged, the weight of her guilt crushing her. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben stood, pacing the room as he ran a hand through his hair. "I can't believe this. I trusted you, Sophie. I thought we were happy. I never meant to hurt you," she said, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." "That's not good enough," Ben snapped, his voice rising. "You don't accidentally betray your family." The sound of Lily's footsteps on the stairs silenced them both. "Mom? Dad?" she called, her voice sleepy. Sophie wiped her eyes and forced a smile. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. Everything's fine." As Lily retreated upstairs, the silence between Sophie and Ben became unbearable. Finally, Ben spoke, his voice cold. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this." Sophie's heart shattered. "Ben, please. I need time," he said, cutting her off. "And you need to figure out what you really want." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sophie alone with her guilt and regret. She knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the decisions she made next would determine whether she could salvage her life or lose everything she had ever cared about. The days after Ben's revelation were a blur of silence and strained civility. He avoided Sophie as much as possible, retreating to the guest room at night and throwing himself into work during the day. For Lily's sake, they maintained a facade of normalcy, but Sophie could feel the foundation of their family crumbling beneath her feet. At work, Sophie was distracted and withdrawn. Anna noticed immediately. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said one afternoon, cornering Sophie in the break room. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Sophie's defenses were too worn down to put on a convincing act. "It's complicated," she admitted. Anna hesitated before speaking. "You know you can talk to me, right? Whatever it is, I'm here." Sophie nodded, but she couldn't bring herself to explain. What could she say? That she had destroyed her marriage for a fleeting connection with an old flame? Instead, she offered a weak smile and excused herself, leaving Anna watching her with concern. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was unraveling as well. His wife, Grace, had grown suspicious of his absences and late-night phone calls. One evening, as Ethan returned home from work, Grace was waiting for him in the living room. "We need to talk," she said, her tone icy. Ethan froze, his heart sinking. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Grace repeated, her voice rising. "You tell me, Ethan. You've been distant, distracted, sneaking off for hours at a time. What's going on?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, but this confrontation left him floundering. "I've been overwhelmed with work," he said weakly. It's just been a stressful few months. Grace narrowed her eyes. Don't lie to me, Ethan. I'm not an idiot. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Grace spoke again, her voice trembling. Is there someone else? Ethan hesitated too long before answering. Grace's face crumpled, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Oh my God, she whispered. There is. Grace, don't, she said sharply, holding up a hand. I don't want your excuses. I want the truth. Who is she? Ethan looked away, guilt and shame washing over him. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Grace shouted, tears streaming down her face. You've betrayed me, Ethan. You've betrayed our family. How could you do this? Ethan had no answer. He watched helplessly as Grace stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, leaving Ethan alone with his regret. Back in Sophie's home, the tension between her and Ben finally boiled over during a rare moment alone. They had just put Lily to bed, and the silence in the house was oppressive. We can't keep living like this, Ben said, his voice low but firm. I need to know where we stand, Sophie. Are you still seeing him? No, Sophie said quickly. I ended it. Ben's eyes searched hers for any sign of deceit. Do you love him? The question took Sophie by surprise. She opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. Did she love Ethan? Or was she clinging to the fantasy of what he represented? Excitement, passion, and a chance to escape the monotony of her life. Her hesitation was answer enough for Ben. He stood, his expression hardening. That's what I thought. Ben, please, Sophie said, standing as well. I'm trying to fix this. I want to fix this. Do you? Ben asked, his voice rising. Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you're still halfway out the door. I'm not, Sophie insisted, tears streaming down her face. I made a mistake, but I love you. I love Lily. I want us to work. Ben shook his head, his anger giving way to exhaustion. Love isn't enough, Sophie. Trust matters too. And right now, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. His words were like a knife to her heart. Sophie sank back into her chair, sobbing as Ben left the room. She realized then that rebuilding their marriage would be far harder than she had anticipated. And she wasn't sure if it was even possible. Ethan, too, was facing the fallout of his choices. Grace had taken the kids to stay with her sister, leaving Ethan alone in their large, empty house. He tried calling Sophie, but she didn't answer. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his actions. He had destroyed his marriage and alienated his family for a relationship that now felt uncertain and fragile. One evening, as he sat alone in his living room, his phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. I can't talk right now. Everything's falling apart. Ethan stared at the screen, his heart sinking. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her they could get through this together. But deep down, he knew the truth. Their relationship had been built on a foundation of lies and betrayal, and now that foundation was crumbling. The days turned into weeks, and the fallout from Sophie and Ethan's choices rippled through their lives. Sophie barely recognized herself anymore. The vibrant, confident woman she had once been was now consumed by guilt, regret, and the impossible task of holding her family together. Ben had grown colder, more distant, and though they maintained a fragile truce for Lily's sake, their marriage felt like it was held together by a single thread. One night, as Sophie was tidying up after dinner, Lily appeared in the doorway, clutching a drawing in her small hands. "Mommy, look!" Lily exclaimed, holding up the paper. It was a crayon sketch of their family. Sophie, Ben, and Lily standing in front of their house, smiling. "It's us." Sophie's heart clenched at the sight. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, kneeling down to hug her daughter. "You're such a talented artist. Are you and Daddy happy?" Lily asked, her innocent eyes searching Sophie's face. The question hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. "Of course we are," she lied, forcing a smile. "Why do you ask?" Lily shrugged, looking down at her drawing. "Sometimes it feels like you're sad. I don't want you to be sad." Sophie hugged her tightly, fighting back tears. "Don't worry about Mommy and Daddy, okay? We love you very much." As Lily scampered off to her room, Sophie sat on the floor, clutching the drawing. The truth was, she didn't know if she and Ben could ever find their way back to happiness. And she didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending for Lily's sake. Ethan's life was in shambles as well. Grace hadn't returned, and his attempts to contact her were met with silence. He spent his nights pacing the empty halls of his home, his thoughts consumed by regret. He knew he had destroyed the trust of the one person who had stood by him through everything. And for what? A fleeting connection that now felt more like a curse than a blessing. One evening, Ethan finally reached Sophie. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Sophie hesitated. "Ethan, I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," he said. "I need to see you. Just once more." Against her better judgment, Sophie agreed. They met at a quiet park on the edge of town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. Sophie arrived first, sitting on a bench and staring at the horizon. When Ethan appeared, he looked as haggard as she felt. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Sophie said before Ethan could speak. "Everything is falling apart. Ben barely talks to me. Lily knows something's wrong. And I don't even know what we're doing anymore." Ethan sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I feel the same way," he admitted. "Grace has left me. The boys don't want to talk to me. I've lost everything." Sophie turned to him, her eyes filled with anguish. "So what do we do? Keep hurting everyone around us? Or end this before it gets worse?" Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Do you think we can ever really go back to the way things were? Before this?" Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I don't think we can." For a long time, they sat in silence, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. Finally, Sophie stood. "I need to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Take care of yourself, Sophie." "You too," she replied before walking away. She didn't look back. That night, Sophie lay awake in bed, her mind racing. She had made a mess of everything, and there was no easy way out. But one thing was clear. She couldn't keep running from the truth. She needed to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how painful. The next morning, Sophie sat down with Ben at the kitchen table. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Ben looked at her, his expression wary. "What is it?" "I've been lying to you," Sophie said, meeting his gaze. "I ended things with Ethan, but I didn't just hurt you. I hurt our family, and I need to own up to that." Ben's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Sophie continued, laying everything out. The lies, the guilt, the choices that had led her to this point. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, "but I want to try to fix this. I want to fix us. If you'll let me." Ben was silent for a long time, his emotions unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sophie, but I owe it to Lily to try." His words were bittersweet, a glimmer of hope in the midst of despair. Sophie nodded, knowing that rebuilding their marriage would be a long, difficult road. But for the first time in months, she felt a sliver of resolve. She would do whatever it took to heal the wounds she had caused, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of herself. The house was quieter now, filled with an uneasy calm that Sophie couldn't quite decide was comforting or stifling. Ben had agreed to stay, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Conversations were polite but clipped, every word measured and weighted. Lily was the glue holding them together, her innocent smiles and nightly hugs the only thing keeping the household from collapsing entirely. Sophie threw herself into routines, hoping that structure would help her navigate the chaos inside her. She spent more time with Lily, helping with homework, baking cookies, and going to the park. Ben noticed but said little, his guarded demeanor unchanged. Yet every now and then, Sophie caught him watching her with a flicker of the warmth that used to define their relationship. At work, Sophie began meeting with a counselor recommended by Anna. She was hesitant at first, but after weeks of carrying the burden alone, the idea of unloading to someone impartial became irresistible. "I don't even know where to start," Sophie admitted during her first session, sitting across from a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calming presence. "Start anywhere," the counselor said gently. "We'll piece it together." Sophie began to talk, hesitantly at first, but soon the words poured out. Her restlessness, the chance meeting with Ethan, the thrill and guilt of the affair, and the fallout that followed. The counselor listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that forced Sophie to confront truths she had been avoiding. "You keep mentioning how you felt trapped," the counselor observed. "Trapped in your routines, in your roles as a wife and mother. Do you think the affair was an escape?" Sophie hesitated. "I guess it was," she admitted. "But it wasn't just about escaping. Ethan made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. And now I feel broken," Sophie said, tears welling in her eyes. "I hurt everyone I care about. And for what? A fantasy?" The counselor leaned forward. "The fact that you're here, willing to face this, shows that you want to heal. But healing takes time and honesty, with yourself and with those you've hurt." Meanwhile, Ethan's life continued to spiral. Grace had filed for divorce, and Ethan had reluctantly agreed to let her have primary custody of the boys. The house felt cavernous and cold without them, the silence a constant reminder of what he had lost. He thought often of Sophie, wondering if she was faring any better, but he resisted the urge to contact her. Their relationship had caused enough damage. One day, while clearing out a drawer, Ethan found an old family photo, him, Grace, and the boys on a beach vacation. The image was a snapshot of a life that felt distant, almost unreal. He stared at it for a long time, grappling with a mix of grief and regret. For the first time, he wondered if the allure of Sophie had been less about her and more about his own dissatisfaction with himself. Back in Sophie's home, small changes began to take root. Ben agreed to attend counseling with her, though his reluctance was clear. Their first joint session was fraught with tension, but it opened a line of communication that had been closed for months. "I don't know if I'll ever get over this," Ben admitted during one session. "Every time I look at you, I think about what you did." Sophie flinched but nodded. "I don't expect you to forget. I just want a chance to earn back your trust." "Why did you do it?" Ben asked, his voice raw. "Why wasn't our life enough?" Sophie struggled to find the words. "It wasn't about you or our life," she said finally. "It was about me. I felt invisible, stuck, and Ethan made me feel seen." Ben's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sophie realized that his silence wasn't just anger. It was pain. She reached for his hand, and to her surprise, he didn't pull away. As the weeks turned into months, Sophie and Ben began to rebuild their marriage, brick by painful brick. It wasn't easy. Ben's trust in Sophie was fragile, and Sophie's guilt was a constant companion. But they found small victories, a shared laugh over an old memory, a quiet moment watching Lily play in the yard, the occasional touch that felt more natural than forced. For Sophie, the hardest part was letting go of Ethan. Though she hadn't spoken to him since their last meeting, he lingered in her thoughts, a bittersweet reminder of the choices she had made. But as she focused on her family, the hold he had on her began to fade. One afternoon, Sophie received a message from Ethan. "I hope you're doing okay. Take care of yourself." She stared at the words for a long time before deleting the message without responding. It was the first step toward truly moving on. One evening, as Sophie and Ben sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ben broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" Sophie took a deep breath, her heart aching at the uncertainty in his voice. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try. Are you?" Ben looked at her, his expression softening for the first time in months. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think I am." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie felt a glimmer of hope. Their path was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were walking it together. The passage of time brought with it a fragile sense of normalcy. The wounds in Sophie and Ben's marriage hadn't fully healed, but they had begun to scar over. The cracks that once seemed insurmountable were now bridges, fragile ones but bridges nonetheless. One crisp autumn morning, Sophie sat in the kitchen, sipping her coffee as Lily colored at the table. Ben entered, his hair still damp from the shower. "I'm taking the day off," he said, surprising her. "Thought we could all spend some time together." Sophie's heart fluttered at the gesture. "That sounds nice," she said with a small smile. "Lily's been asking to go apple picking." Lily's face lit up. "Can we? Please, Daddy?" Ben chuckled. "Of course. Let's make a day of it." As they drove out to the orchard, the car filled with Lily's chatter and the occasional shared laugh. For the first time in months, Sophie felt a sense of peace. The day was simple but meaningful, a reminder of what they were working to rebuild. At the orchard, Ben reached for Sophie's hand as they walked between the rows of trees. She glanced at him, surprised, but didn't pull away. His touch was tentative, but it felt like a promise. A small step toward rebuilding the intimacy they had lost. Ethan, meanwhile, was coming to terms with his own losses. Grace had moved forward with the divorce, and their house was now eerily empty. He saw his boys on weekends, but their relationship was strained. They were polite but distant, unsure of how to reconcile the father they had once idolized with the man who had hurt their mother. One evening, after dropping them off at Grace's, Ethan sat alone in his car, staring at the house he used to call home. Memories flooded him. Late-night conversations with Grace, teaching the boys to ride their bikes, family movie nights. It all felt so distant, like a life that belonged to someone else. Ethan realized that he couldn't keep holding on to the past. He needed to let go, not just of Grace, but of Sophie, and the fantasy he had built around her. It was time to confront the man he had become and figure out how to move forward. Back at home, Sophie continued her counseling sessions, both alone and with Ben. One day, her counselor asked her a question that had been lingering in the back of her mind. "What have you learned from all this?" Sophie hesitated, her thoughts swirling. "I've learned that I was looking for something outside of myself, validation, excitement, a sense of being seen, when I should have been looking inward," she said slowly. "I was so focused on what I thought was missing that I didn't appreciate what I had." The counselor nodded. "And what do you have now?" "A chance," Sophie said, her voice firm. "A chance to be better, to rebuild my marriage, to be the kind of person my daughter can look up to." One evening, as Sophie and Ben sat together on the couch, she handed him a letter she had written during her counseling session. "What's this?" he asked. "Something I've been working on," Sophie said. "I wanted to put everything into words, the things I haven't been able to say out loud." Ben unfolded the letter and began to read. Sophie watched him, her heart pounding as he took in her words. Apologies for her actions, acknowledgement of the pain she had caused, and a promise to do better. When he finished, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being honest, for trying." Sophie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not perfect, Ben. I'll never be perfect. But I want to fight for us. If you're willing to fight too." Ben reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I am." The next morning, Sophie received an unexpected email from Ethan. It was brief but heartfelt. "Hi, Sophie. I hope this doesn't feel like I'm intruding. I just wanted to say that I'm letting go. Of us, of everything. I realize now that I was chasing something that wasn't real. I'm working on being a better person, and I hope you are too. I wish you and your family all the best. Take care, Ethan." Sophie read the message twice before closing her laptop. She felt a strange sense of relief, an acknowledgement that their chapter was truly over. Ethan had been a part of her life for a moment, but that moment had passed. It was time to focus on the future. As winter approached, Sophie and Ben continued their slow journey toward healing. It wasn't perfect, and some days were harder than others. But they were trying, and that effort brought a glimmer of hope. One snowy evening, as the family sat by the fireplace, Lily climbed onto Sophie's lap with a book. "Can you read to me, Mommy?" "Of course, sweetheart," Sophie said, wrapping her arms around her daughter. As she read aloud, she glanced at Ben, who was watching them with a soft smile. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt a flicker of contentment. She had made mistakes, but she was still here. She still had a chance to make things right. The months that followed were a slow, steady climb toward something resembling peace. Sophie and Ben worked hard to rebuild the foundation of their marriage, one conversation, one shared moment at a time. It wasn't easy, and some wounds still felt raw, but there was a mutual understanding that they were in this together, for Lily, for their shared history, and for themselves. One spring morning, Sophie stood in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower bed. The air was crisp, the sky bright and clear, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of calm. Ben appeared at her side, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You've been out here all morning," he said, handing her a mug. "What are you thinking about?" Sophie took a sip, savoring the warmth. "About how far we've come. About how lucky I am to still have this, to still have us." Ben nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's been hard, but I think we're stronger for it." Sophie smiled, her chest swelling with gratitude. "I hope so. I know I am." Ben reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Sophie squeezed his hand, silently vowing to never take these small moments for granted again. Across town, Ethan was packing up his house. The sale had gone through, and he was preparing to move to a smaller apartment closer to his boys. It was a bittersweet process, letting go of the home that had once been filled with laughter and love. But as he taped up the last box, he felt a surprising sense of relief. This was a chance to start over, to rebuild his life with honesty and intention. Grace had agreed to an amicable co-parenting arrangement, and while their relationship was far from mended, there was a mutual respect that gave Ethan hope. He had started seeing a counselor himself, working to understand the choices that had led him down such a destructive path. It was painful but necessary, and he felt lighter with each step forward. As he loaded the last box into his car, Ethan paused to look at the house one final time. He whispered a quiet goodbye, not just to the home but to the person he had been. It was time to move on. On a sunny afternoon, Sophie and Ben took Lily to the park. They watched her run from the swings to the slide, her laughter filling the air. Sophie leaned into Ben, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever get back to how things were?" she asked quietly. Ben thought for a moment before replying. "I don't think we'll ever be exactly the same, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can be better." Sophie nodded, his words settling over her like a balm. "I want that too." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past still present but no longer suffocating. It was there, a reminder of their mistakes and their resilience, but it didn't define them. They were moving forward step by careful step. That evening, Sophie stood by the window watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a reminder of the beauty that could come after even the darkest storms. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at it. It was a message from Anna. "Let's grab coffee soon. I miss you." Sophie smiled and typed back, "I'd love that." She set the phone down, realizing how much she had missed the simplicity of friendship. It was another part of herself she was eager to reclaim. Ben entered the room, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the sunset. "It is," Sophie agreed. She turned to him, her smile soft but genuine. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Ben kissed her forehead. "Thank you for fighting for us." As night fell and their home settled into quiet, Sophie reflected on the journey they had taken. It had been messy, painful, and full of moments where giving up would have been easier. But they had chosen to fight, not just for their marriage, but for the people they wanted to become. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But as Sophie drifted to sleep beside Ben, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. They had weathered the storm, and now they were learning to dance in the rain. Dear listeners, Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.